Your life keeps working. You wake up, reply to messages, handle tasks, go to work, talk to people, take care of small things and bigger ones. Nothing seems out of control. Nothing feels too urgent. And yet, there is a persistent sense of weariness that follows you through all of it. It is not an obvious physical tiredness. It is not the kind of exhaustion that comes after a very heavy day or an extreme effort. It is something quieter, more diffuse, harder to point to with precision. You keep doing what needs to be done, but you feel that your mind is always slightly heavy, as if you were carrying something invisible all the time, as if rest were never quite enough to truly ease it. What is curious is that, from the outside, there is no clear reason for this tiredness. You are not in crisis. You are not under unbearable pressure. You are not living through a major emotional conflict that would explain this constant drain. Even so, your mental energy always seems lower than expected. What almost no one notices is that this kind of tiredness does not announce itself dramatically. It does not interrupt life. It does not stop you from functioning. It simply makes everything a little heavier, a little slower, a little less clear. You wake up with your mind already switched on. Before you even get out of bed, thoughts begin to appear. Small pending matters, things that need to be done, details that cannot be forgotten. Throughout the day, you keep dealing with all of this, and you do it well. But by the end of the day, there is a strange feeling that your mind worked too much, even without a specific reason. Rest arrives, but it does not fully restore you. You sit down, try to relax, but you feel that something is still running inside. There is no obvious tension. There is no clear anxiety. There is just a constant activity, almost in the background, that does not switch off. This explains something that often confuses many people: why mental tiredness shows up precisely when life is relatively stable. In theory, this should be the lightest phase. Fewer problems, fewer urgencies, less external pressure. But in practice, this is when many people begin to feel mentally drained. On weekends, this becomes even more noticeable. You finally have free time. There are no immediate deadlines. There are no major demands. And still, the mind does not rest. It wanders. It jumps from one thought to another. It replays scenes from the week. It imagines future situations. It mentally organizes things that do not even need to be organized at that moment. None of this seems serious, but all of it consumes energy. And what is most unsettling is that this consumption happens without you realizing it. There is no clear effort. There is no heavy task. There is only continuity. You do not feel like you are forcing your mind. It is simply on. Here is an important point that changes how this experience can be understood. This tiredness does not come from a specific event, but from a silent accumulation. It is not something that happens all at once. It is something that forms gradually, day after day, thought after thought. And because you keep functioning, this wear goes unnoticed. You adapt to it. You begin to consider it normal to always feel a little mentally tired. The problem is that, over time, this normalization has a cost. Clarity decreases. The sense of inner space becomes smaller. Everything seems to require a bit more effort than before. And still, you cannot clearly point to the reason. This is the silent discomfort that accompanies many functional, mentally active people. It is not a collapse. It is not drama. It is a slow, constant, almost invisible drain. And understanding why this drain happens begins with recognizing that it does not come from weakness, from lack of ability, or from something being wrong with you, but from a specific mode of functioning that is rarely observed closely. This specific mode of functioning becomes clearer when you look at the role the mind has taken on in your life. For many functional, organized, responsible people, the mind has become the main tool for keeping everything in order. Planning, anticipating, evaluating, comparing, adjusting. These activities have become almost automatic, happening all the time, without any conscious effort to initiate them. What almost no one notices is that the mind does not clearly distinguish when this kind of activity is truly necessary and when it could slow down. It learns to operate in a continuous mode. And once that mode is established, it does not shut itself off just because the day becomes lighter. This explains why the mind remains active even when there is no urgent demand. It is not reacting to a specific problem. It is simply following a pattern that has been reinforced over time. The human mind was not designed to rest spontaneously. It was shaped to monitor the environment, identify risks, organize information, and maintain a certain degree of control over what is happening around it. This mode of functioning was extremely useful for a long time, and it still is in many contexts. The problem arises when this monitoring no longer has a clear object. When there is nothing external demanding constant attention, the mind does not simply stop, it redirects its focus. And in the absence of something external, that focus often turns inward. Thoughts begin to take the place of tasks. Loose ideas become objects of attention. Hypothetical scenarios start being followed as if they were relevant in that moment. Not because they are important, but because attention needs something to attach to. Here is the point that changes how this experience is understood. The mind remains active not because there is a problem, but because attention has lost a clear destination. Attention without a destination rarely stays neutral. It begins to move on its own, jumping from thought to thought, from idea to idea, from scenario to scenario, and each small movement consumes a bit of energy. This mode of functioning is so common that it goes unnoticed. You do not feel like you are thinking too much. You simply feel that your mind does not turn off. And because this thinking is not charged with intense emotion, it does not draw attention. It does not feel like anxiety. It does not feel like serious worry. It just feels normal. This needs to be said clearly. This experience does not indicate mental weakness. It does not indicate lack of ability. It does not indicate that you do not know how to rest. In fact, it often appears precisely in people who learn to use their minds efficiently and consistently. The problem is not thinking, it is the absence of real pauses between thoughts. When there is a concrete problem, the mind organizes itself around it. There is a beginning, a middle, and an end. Even if it is tiring, there is a relatively closed cycle. When that problem does not exist, the mind remains open, operating without a clear closure. It reviews things that have already passed. It anticipates things that have not yet happened. It analyzes details that do not need analysis at that moment. This mode of functioning creates the feeling of a busy mind without a reason. And over time, it also creates the feeling of tiredness without a clear explanation. Another important point is that modern life offers very few natural signals of closure. Work ends, but the mind stays connected. Conversations end, but mental simulations remain. The day comes to an end, but thoughts keep organizing the next one. There is no longer a clear boundary between activity and pause. Everything blends into an intermediate state of continuous functioning. In this state, the mind is not fully engaged in something specific, but it is also not turned off. It remains in a light state of readiness, observing, checking, following possibilities. And this kind of readiness consumes energy quietly. This explains why many people feel tired even on days that seem calm. There was no intense effort. There was no emotional conflict. But there was active attention all the time. Understanding this helps remove personal blame from the experience. Tiredness does not appear because you are doing something wrong. It appears because the mind has been kept in continuous operation for too long without clear pauses. And when you begin to see this tiredness as an effect of constant use rather than as a personal flaw, something reorganizes internally. The experience stops feeling like a confusing mystery and starts to make sense within a broader logic, one that also helps explain the hidden cost of this mode of functioning over time. As time goes on, this continuous functioning begins to produce effects that do not appear immediately but accumulate steadily. It is not something you notice on a specific day. It settles in gradually, almost without warning. The mind stays active, monitoring, following thoughts, reviewing small things, even when nothing urgent is happening. And while this goes on, energy is being consumed in the background. What almost no one notices is that this kind of expenditure does not show up as effort. It shows up as wear. You do not feel like you are overexerting yourself. You simply feel a bit more tired than you should, a bit less clear, a bit heavier inside. This is the hidden cost of continuous mental functioning. It shows up, for example, at the end of the day. You finish what you were doing, look back, and realize that nothing was particularly difficult. Even so, there is a sense of mental exhaustion, as if the mind had been used the entire time, even in the gaps. It also shows up on weekends. You expect to feel renewed, but it does not fully happen. Rest does not restore you the way it used to. The mind remains occupied, even if lightly, in a dispersed, fragmented way. This explains something that often confuses people: why moments that are theoretically calm can be more tiring than days that are truly busy. When the day is full, there is focus. Attention anchors itself to clear tasks. There is a beginning, a middle, and an end. When the day is empty, attention spreads. It jumps from thought to thought, from idea to idea, without staying long on anything. And this continuous dispersion consumes energy slowly but persistently. A simple example helps make this visible. Imagine a Sunday afternoon with no commitments. You are at home with nothing specific to do. You pick up your phone, scroll for a bit, put it down. You walk around the house, you sit again. Meanwhile, the mind remains active. It thinks about small pending matters from the week. It replays old conversations. It imagines future scenarios that may never happen. None of this seems relevant, but all of it keeps attention switched on. When you notice, hours have passed, and there is a strange sense of tiredness. Not physical, mental. This tiredness comes from the fact that the mind never entered real rest. It simply changed objects repeatedly. Here is an important point that often goes unnoticed. The mind does not need to be occupied with big problems to wear down. It wears down through continuity, thought after thought, idea after idea, without real pauses between them. This constant flow reduces mental clarity. Things start to feel more confusing. Simple decisions require more effort. The sense of inner space diminishes. None of this happens abruptly. It is an accumulation. And because this accumulation is not accompanied by clear warning signs, it is easily ignored. You keep functioning. You keep handling everything, but at an invisible cost. Another common effect of this wear is the feeling that the mind is always too full. There is no real silence. There are only short intervals between thoughts. This creates the impression that there is never a moment of deep rest. Even when you are doing nothing, something continues happening internally. What changes everything here is realizing that this tiredness is not a sign of personal failure. It is not lack of ability. It is not disinterest in life. It is the predictable result of a mind that stayed in continuous operation for too long, without proper recovery. This understanding helps ease part of the tension that forms around tiredness itself. You stop demanding so much from yourself. You stop trying to force rest. And gradually, you begin to see that the issue is not doing fewer things, but better understanding the impact this mode of functioning has on mental energy over time, which opens space for a different way of seeing the mind itself and the quiet weight it carries. When you start to see this tiredness from this perspective, something important shifts internally. The mind stops being seen as a problem that needs to be fought and starts being understood as a system that was active for too long without real pauses. This reframing changes the tone of the experience. Because instead of fighting tiredness or trying to eliminate it by force, you begin to recognize it as a coherent signal of continuous use, not a defect, not a failure, not a personal inadequacy. What almost no one realizes is that much of the suffering associated with mental fatigue comes from how it is interpreted. When you believe that being tired means being weak, unmotivated, or inadequate, the weight increases. The mind, in addition to being tired, starts being judged, and that judgment adds more mental activity to a system that is already overloaded. Here's the point that changes how all of this is understood. The mind is not failing when it feels heavy. It is responding to a prolonged pattern of functioning, thinking, analyzing, anticipating, reviewing. All of these are skills. But skills used without interruption also generate wear, even when they are well executed, even when they produce results. When this wear is understood as something logical, predictable, and human, the relationship with it begins to change. Not because the tiredness disappears immediately, but because it stops being a hostile mystery. There is a profound difference between feeling tired and feeling wrong for being tired. The first is a physiological and cognitive experience. The second is a mental construction that amplifies the weight of the experience. When this layer of judgment is removed, something softens. The mind remains active, but it no longer needs to defend itself. It no longer needs to be forced to work better. This understanding also helps reveal that mental clarity is not a permanent state of lightness. It is often simply the absence of conflict with one's own internal functioning. When you understand why the mind stays busy, why energy is slowly drained, why rest does not always restore as it once did, the experience changes texture. It becomes more intelligible, less opaque, less threatening. This does not mean that everything is resolved. It does not mean that the mind automatically slows down. It simply means that you begin to see what is happening with greater clarity, and clarity begins exactly there, not in silencing the mind, not in forcing rapid changes, but in understanding the functioning that was happening automatically without being observed. When this understanding settles in, even subtly, the mind stops spending energy trying to fix itself all the time. It does not need to prove anything. It does not need to be different from what it is in that moment. This reduction of internal conflict, on its own, already changes the experience of tiredness. It continues to exist, but it occupies less emotional space. A tired mind starts being seen as a mind that was active for too long, not as a defective mind, and that difference in interpretation matters more than it seems, because over time, the way you understand your own functioning shapes the way you live inside your own head. When all of this begins to make sense, an even subtler perception emerges, that not every thought needs to be followed. Not every mental movement needs constant attention. Not everything that passes through the mind requires immediate engagement. This perception does not arrive as a technique or an instruction. It arises as a natural consequence of understanding. And perhaps that is exactly where the internal experience begins to feel a little lighter. Not because something was fixed, but because something was finally understood.